Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Tournament Podcast. This is Marty, along with my brothers Tom and Mike, and excited this week to go back to our roots old school professional wrestling. What I prefer the most, my favorite topic, professional wrestling. So I'm excited to go back and being that it's around the Halloween time of year, I decided to use that as well. So this week we are going to judge the scariest professional wrestling gimmicks. So this one will be a little bit lighter than most. The criteria is kind of just our personal opinion, but it's supposed to be a gimmick of someone that is scary or ruthless, even the aesthetic or how they wrestle. So I think this one will be very interesting. Um, so I'm excited to jump in. Um, Let me first let you guys know this is going to be actually a 10-man tournament. I've got two buys.
Ooh.
I decided who I was going to give the buys to. The first buy is going to go to Abdullah the Butcher, classic. The
Yep.
second buy is going to go to The Undertaker. Other participants in this tournament include Ox Baker, Abyss, Bray Wyatt, Gangrel, Kane, Mankind, Bruiser Brody, and Kevin Sullivan. So it's mainly old school. We have a current guy in there. So I typically lean towards the old school. But before we get started here, if you guys are enjoying the content, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. That would really help us out. Always, you can comment, let us know what you think. Is there somebody that I missed that should definitely be in there? Do you have any comments for what we should do going forward? With that being said, we can jump into it unless Tom or Mike, do you guys have anything before we get started here?
No.
Nice.
I don't either.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm ready to
Do this.
Well,
get going, and I will let the audience know that I'm not overly familiar. If they've watched any of our previous videos with the newer content, so a few of these guys, it's going to be a little difficult for me to judge, but I do know the majority of them. So
and that actually played into my selections because I know that you aren't, a fan of the current or the last, 20 years, and I'm not a big fan of it either. But so I did kind of, I skewed the people in here based on that too. And I put all of our contestants here into our proprietary tournament generator to give us our seating. And again, Abdullah and Undertaker get a bye. So in the first matchup, we have Ox Baker going against Abyss. Um, Tom, do you want to go first on this one?
yeah. Obviously, as I just mentioned, or maybe not obviously, but I am much more familiar with Ox Baker. As I, well, you know what, and I have to maybe take a step back. Maybe I am equally familiar in this case because Ox was a little bit before my time, but I do know a little bit, from watching videos of his style. I certainly know the character, and we mentioned him last week in Escape from New York. Um, and then Abyss, I do know Abyss a little bit, and if I'm thinking, he was and don't give me, was it a TNA? Was that who he was? A
Yeah,
TNA wrestler? All right.
exactly.
Okay, and so I've seen probably, ironically, more Abyss in terms of matches or angles or whatever it is than Ox Baker because he was so old school. But All right, but let me think here. So in terms of the scariest gimmick, I would just take it from the perspective of just watching it. And you're like, oh my god, the maybe how real it felt, and what kind of damage you really would think realistically this person could do to someone. If you came across them in a dark alley, who would you least want to see? Um, oh, well, yeah, and in this case, I think I don't even, and I hate to even say that it was my judgment being skewed because of Escape from New York. But and also, back in the day, and I don't even know if this would be valid criteria. These guys lived their gimmicks. I mean, in Ox Baker, he was, what you saw in ring, and that was kind of what you got in real life as well. So um, I'm going to go ahead and go with Ox Baker.
Nice. Um, Mike, what do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, Ox Baker, believe was known to be a crazy man. He certainly looked like a crazy man from the eyebrows and the didn't he have a Fu Manchu mustache, if I recall?
Yep.
Possibly, I don't know if he was the originator of the heart punch, but I believe he used a heart punch, which getting punched in your heart sounds terrifying enough, let alone by somebody that looks like Ox Baker does with the stash and the eyebrows and whatnot. But so yeah, I know Ox Baker, definitely did look like a wild man. But Abyss, of course, the whole get up with the mask. At one point, he had was it James Mitchell was his manager, and James Mitchell was kind of the I don't know if he was kind of like I don't know if I want to say a demonic character, but I think he was kind of, yeah, that's, I guess, due to lack of a better term. I say he was kind of demonic or whatever, evil manager. But so yeah, kind of had the whole gimmick there with James Mitchell, and then with the mask and everything, and obviously you got your Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, the best of the best in horror. Most of them wear masks. Um, Not comparing Abyss to those legends by any mean, but just because the mask and everything, I'm gonna give the slight edge to Abyss, and I'm gonna create a conundrum right out of the gate for Marty.
Nice. Here
I
we
have to
go.
use my veto.
Uh-oh. Well, Abyss is Tom mentioned from TNA. I know when Abyss first, started out in TNA that he was a very brutal character. I think he may have also been in storyline, locked up or in an asylum or something for. Um, I know there was something about a murder, but Abyss, I think, later became kind of comedic when he became a face. Um, Abyss is a monster, 6'7", 6'8", humongous man, scary without question. Ox Baker, like Tom said, he is a little before our time, but I mean, he was around, when we were young, but I don't know that he was an active wrestler in our youth. But Ox was also a big man, especially for back in the day when he was wrestling. Um, and Ox Baker legitimately killed two wrestlers with the heart punch. I shouldn't laugh, but I think it was later mentioned that they had some kind of like pre-existing conditions, but Ox Baker killed two people in the ring. So based on that, I'm afraid of him. I would give the edge to Ox Baker for the win in this first round.
All right.
Oh boy.
Well, that puts some pressure on Mike to use his
Oh,
veto if he wants to.
It sure does, and I will not, with all due
Nice.
respect to Abyss. Well, and I will say, kind of like Tom said, how he's not overly familiar with the newer content. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of the old school stuff, but again, Ox Baker was, obviously before, well, especially well before my time, even though I am familiar with Ox and the whole appearance and all that. But even though I don't watch a lot of TNA or never have, I'm definitely more familiar with Abyss, so that did play into it a little bit. But yeah, I'm not a big enough fan of Abyss to wait. No, I shouldn't say waste. Waste my veto on him. Sorry,
Poor,
Abyss.
poor
But
Abyss.
yep, sorry, Abyss. But
Uh,
is moving on.
All right.
our next matchup here, guys, is I don't know that Tom would be familiar with the matches, but they had a feud definitely. It's going to be Kane versus Mankind. Um,
Wow.
Mike, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, sure, man. This is actually because either one of these guys could have ended up in the finals potentially, and again, that's why we always say the matchups are everything. Because man, you got Mankind, who started out in boiler rooms with a rat and pulling his hair out, wearing that leather mask thing over his face, but then on the other hand, you had Kane, who just again, a big monstrous guy, um looked cool with the whole get up and the mask, and you know came out and ripped the door off of a cage in his debut. I mean, that's frightening in and of itself. And this is kind of like you alluded to with the previous round with Abyss. Like, both of these guys at various times went from being more, horror themed, I guess you would say, gimmicks, or more intimidating, to more on the comedic side. But just kind of going off of the original, I guess original form, or whatever you want to say, of both of these guys. Oh man, this is a tough one, but my gut just tells me, just looking at him, excuse me,
Oh no.
just looking at him. I mean, obviously, because I had Mankind with the mask. Well, both of them with the mask on, but but I think Kane for me would be a little more intimidating just because of the size. He was like 6'10", jacked. Oh man, that red mask. With, I think he had like the one of his eyes may have been white or something. He had a contact or something in it. It just made it look extra creepy. So I'm gonna go ahead and go with Kane to move on in this case.
Mm. Well, I will jump in on this one here. This is a very tough matchup. These guys, had quite the feud in WWE. Back in the 90s. Like Mike said, Mankind, who, obviously Mick Foley, his gimmick, he started out in dirty boiler rooms, and even, before the Mankind, when he was Cactus Jack, even though the outward appearance might not be scary, well, it kind of was. No offense, Mick, but Mankind to me was scary because he lived the gimmick that he had. He'd rip out clumps of his hair, and Mick Foley's voice that he'd use was scary. Um, Kane, like Mike said, absolute monster. Such a huge man. I mean, what is he, legit 6'7" or 6'8" as well? Just, when he was younger, he was so thick, and yeah, definitely intimidating, no question. Whew, both guys have had their runs as heels, but then babyface. Um, I'm I'm gonna go with the very slight edge, actually, to Mankind, based on the fact that he at least would talk, and the things he would say and his voice to me were actually pretty darn scary. So, Tom, you have a tiebreaker here: Kane versus Mankind.
Yeah, and as soon as you mentioned the matchup, to me it was easy. The problem with Mankind is that you kind of knew who it was. The body was unimpressive, very high skills. Well, however you want to put it. I mean, a hell of a performer. Let's put it that way. And Mick Foley, but I mean, you knew it was Dude Love, you knew it was Cactus Jack, and they just put a mask on him and made him somebody else, as WWF, WWE always did. Now, Kane's the same way. He was that goofy Isaac Yankem dentist character, but I think the difference was when they packaged him as Kane, I don't think people immediately thought, oh, that's Glenn Jacobs. Now he's Kane. I don't know if you knew who it was. So there was that element of not knowing who this was, to go actually the opposite of your point. I think the not talking made him more scary. Um, Paul Bearer was fine. I mean, I was obviously as well, and I keep saying obviously, but as an old school wrestler like Percy Pringle a lot more than Paul Bearer, but he certainly fit with the Kane and Undertaker gimmicks. But I just think Kane, especially the beginning, the first run of Kane before they started making changes, and that was a really scary character. As Mike had mentioned, the size. I mean, and again, using my initial criteria, you run into these guys, at the end of a dark alley. Would you rather have a guy that's built like Mankind standing down there, or Glenn Jacobs? So my choice for this one is Kane. So Marty, what are you going to do about it?
Nice.
Well,
Here it comes.
I'm actually going to kind of do a shocker here. I'm not going to use my veto. It's so close to me on these. Um, I still think, I mean, Kane was so physically menacing, but again, those promos in the boiler room and Mankind's like high shrieking voice to me were scary as all get out. But it's close enough where I will not use my veto. Sorry about that, Mick.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, we can still get you on the podcast for an interview one of these days. All right. Our next matchup here is going to be Bray Wyatt going against Gangrel. I'll actually go ahead and do this one first here. We have a mix here of not really old school, sort of old school, and Gangrel versus Bray Wyatt, who I believe he's currently a free agent. Obviously, Bray Wyatt from the WWE and the Wyatt family. I will say WWE actually did a really good job over the years with the Wyatt family. Um, not being too hokey with it, but showing that they have, kind of supernatural powers. The creepy entrance when the lights would go out and Bray Wyatt would have the lantern. Bray Wyatt was also known to do, I don't know what you call it, kind of like a reverse scorpion walk where he would arch his back and go all the way down with his hands, his head down backwards and walk backwards, like that, if it makes sense what I'm trying to say, but it was always creepy. Gangrel, a little bit, sort of old schoolish. Gangrel is probably obviously more well known for his time in the WWE with the Brood in the late 90s. I thought the Brood was a pretty cool gimmick. He'd have the um, glass of blood that he'd spit out, the entrance for a while when he'd come up to the floor. He legitimately had his teeth shaved into fangs, so his look was very scary. This one is pretty darn close for me, actually, but just based on, again, him having his teeth shaved down in real life, um, I'm going to give the slight edge to Gangrel on this one. Tom, who do you have?
Okay. Well, this is going to be one of those cases where, as I mentioned, I know who Bray Wyatt is, but I've never seen him perform. I've never seen an entrance. I've seen some stills. I think he used to come out with a couple other guys and he carried a lantern or something, but I don't know anything past that. Well, I mean, besides like knowing who he is and, his lineage, but Gangrel, though, I am familiar with. And I have to say that when he came out with the Brood, their entrance in terms of coming up through the fire and the music, and again, the music I'm sure was created. Who's the gentleman's name? I tried to get him on the podcast.
Is it Johnson?
Yeah, Jim Johnson.
Yes, Jim
Oh,
John.
yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. But yeah, that the music is just so fitting. It's so catchy and cool. I mean, it just kind of gave him a swag, but kept that scary element. So without going on too far, and a lot of it just because I'm not really familiar with Bray Wyatt and what he did, I'm going to go with Gangrel.
Okay, so we have so far unanimous. Mike, if you feel passionate enough about Bray, you could use a veto. If not, Gangrel advances.
Now, I will say that the Fiend specifically. I mean, even just the plain like swamp dwelling Bray Wyatt character, could be scary or intimidating, but the Fiend specifically, with again the mask, and he carried the lantern that looked like his like the head of his previous incarnation. So he basically was carrying his own head around as a lantern, and he had the his entrance music was tweaked to sound spookier, if you will. And so yeah, I was a big fan of and again, the mask I thought looked amazing. Shout out to Tom Savini, who I believe created that mask. So I was a big fan of the Fiend gimmick. But yeah, on the flip side, the Attitude Era, that's kind of when I was really big into wrestling, in my teens still at the time. And even though I think we're all big WCW fans, of course, flip back and forth. So I was also a WWF fan, and Gangrel was probably a big part of the reason why. Everything from, like Tom said, the music and the entrance was awesome, and the music is still one of my all-time favorite professional wrestling entrance themes. And then just the look of Gangrel again, with the teeth that were real, like Marty said, he had teeth shaved down, so he legitimately had fangs. So yeah, I thought, and then they'd give people blood baths, and he had, well, as Marty called it, a glass of blood, but excuse him, the goblet is what I
Yeah.
think he meant to say. Um, but no, so everything from the entrance, the music, the goblet of blood, and of course those damn fangs being legit. Said as much as I like the Fiend gimmick, I gotta give the nod to Gangrel here, because to go as far for your gimmick as to legitly have your teeth shaved down to fangs, I mean, that says a lot for me. So I feel like I can't go against Gangrel yet. So all due
Nice.
respect to Bray, but Gangrel is gonna sweep this matchup.
Nice. Our first
Yeah.
clean sweep of this episode here. So, just real briefly, Ox Baker, who previously won over Abyss, will be going against Abdullah the Butcher in the next round. Gangrel, who was just victorious, will go up against Undertaker in the next round. So we have some doozies here. Next one, we have the absolute legend Bruiser Brody versus also kind of another legendary as far as his whole package, what he meant to the business, I should say, Kevin Sullivan. Mike, what do you think of this?
Oh boy.
All right.
Oh boy.
Oh,
sure.
my apologies.
Oh no.
I
F
accidentally
me.
muted.
Did you?
Um,
Yeah.
my bad.
Accidentally. Air quotes.
Did
Yeah,
you?
F Kevin Sullivan. That's how I feel.
Ooh.
No, I'm kidding.
Well, so
So we
much for
got
him
what?
as a guest on the podcast.
I'm kidding, Mr. Sullivan. Big fan. Love your work. Or do I? We'll find out. Um, so we got what? Bruiser Brody v. Kevin Sullivan. Again, Bruiser Brody's another one of those guys that I'm familiar with the wild man appearance. Um, not as familiar with the ring work because again, even though he was still around when I was a kid, I was more into the big two, if you will, or I guess NWA slash WCW, and of course WWF. So I didn't see a whole lot of Bruiser Brody, but I know again he was a legit wild man, and he definitely looked the part with the long crazy hair, and then Kevin Sullivan, though, on the other hand, while not as intimidating physically, was another. What was the gimmick he had? Not the
Is it Prince of Darkness?
yeah, the
or-
Prince of Darkness. Yeah, because I know it was another kind of a horror themed gimmick, and again, I'm very familiar with Kevin Sullivan, but I think that gimmick was more like in probably the mid '80s, possibly. So, wow, this one's a tricky one, but just because of the wild man appearance, the stature on top of it, because Brody was a big man, intimidating to look at, and I mean, I figure if you're crazy enough to legit frighten Lex Luger, then I don't want anything to do with you either. So, um, I'm gonna go with Bruiser Brody in this round.
Nice.
What?
Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, again, this was one that as soon as you mentioned the bracket, I knew the winner, at least in my mind. And interestingly enough, I think these are two pioneers of the business. I think both of these gentlemen probably knew every aspect of the business. Behind the scenes, could, work cameras if they wanted, obviously bookers, um, you know, et cetera, et cetera, everything to do with the business, the financials. Both extremely smart guys. I think Kevin Sullivan gets credit for that, for being one of the greats of all time. I think people forget about Bruiser Brody in that regard because his life was, cut short. But in terms of this tournament and Scary, I'm going to have to go with Bruiser Brody. I just think that character, just that unchained, kind of wild, not knowing what he's going to do, madman type of a character. And we've mentioned in previous podcasts that, people having certain gimmicks, but they made it work and they were able to pull it off. I mean, Bruiser Brody. I mean, wow, was he able to pull that off? I mean, he was just perfect. I mean, the look, the size, he came down to the ring barking. I mean, he just, or whatever you want to call that. I mean, he was so believable. So believable. And again, Kevin Sullivan's a big man, don't get me wrong, but Bruiser Brody was that Kane size, large guy. So, um, Bruiser, and I mentioned that first part because it has nothing to do with the scariness, but I've seen a lot of documentary pieces behind the scenes stuff with Bruiser Brody and just how intelligent of a guy he was. So I just thought that would be nice to mention. But I guess kind of going hand in hand with that, the ability to pull off a gimmick as well. I mean, not too many guys did it better than Bruiser Brody. So Mr. Bruiser Brody is my vote.
Well, it's two already for Brody, so I would have to be passionate enough to go with Kevin to use my veto. Let me kind of say that Kevin Sullivan is definitely old school. Kevin Sullivan was wrestling in the 70s. Kevin is not a tall man, but he was always built to beat the band. Thick, broad chest. In Florida, in the like early '80s, is where he started his like demonic gimmick, and I know it actually got to the point of believability. I think people would call the authorities and things because they were worried about what he was going to do. He had a stable of individuals. He had Mark Lewin, who was known as the Purple Haze back then, and several other people. Um, Kevin Sullivan was always back in those days in Florida in a feud with Dusty Rhodes as well. But I thought he did an amazing job with his almost again, they'd give it a tinge of supernatural as if he could kind of hypnotize and control the people in his, group. But I mean, as silly as that was, it never really went overboard. Bruiser Brody, you guys hit the nail on the head. He was, I mean, Bruiser Brody was an attraction. He was his own gimmick just because he was a wild man, like you said, a monster, 6'7", 6'8", thick. He had the long wild hair, the furry boots. He'd come out with a chain. He'd be swinging through the air. Abdullah is in here also. He had a first round bye. He had some incredible bloody matches. Not incredible as far as like work rate and moves, but just for physicality and blood, his battles with Abdullah. But I don't want to go on and on. I agree with you guys. Clean sweep, Bruiser Brody.
Nice.
So we have our brackets totally set, and now we're going to go ahead here and get into the next round. I just had mentioned Abdullah. He had a bye. He's going to be going up against Ox Baker. I'll go ahead and just take this one here. Ox Baker, I won't go into a lot of detail because we kind of already talked about him. But, again, Ox Baker for his day was a huge man. He's not 6'7", 6'8", but, I know he was definitely well over 6 feet tall. But, when he was wrestling in the 60s and 70s, that look alone was so unique and terrifying in my opinion. Abdullah, again, kind of like Brody, he was an attraction. He was the gimmick. Anyone that knows anything about Abdullah the Butcher would, if you say, tell me one thing that comes to mind, it's going to be a fork or a foreign object taped up in his trunk. So, I mean, Abdullah was brutal. He tried to maim people. To me, based on, I mean, the fact that he was a wild man from the Sudan, even though he really wasn't, but, he never spoke. There were promos where he'd be eating a raw chicken. I've got to go with Abdullah on this one. Tom, who do you have?
Yeah, this is a toughie. These guys are, I think they played their gimmicks equally as well. Obviously, as I've said that word now about 10 times this podcast, I'm more familiar with Abdullah than I am Ox. And I remember having a little, and I think it was you, had a little Remco Abdullah the Butcher figure back in the day. I can still picture him with those little red tights, and didn't he have the pointy boots, or am I thinking?
Yeah, I think he did have the pointy boots.
The curly pointy boots. Man, were those little figures cool. And I actually do have a few of them now, but I do not have the Abdullah the Butcher. But, boy, scary gimmicks. Yeah, I think Abdullah just had, and probably why you gave him a bye, had a little bit more of an edge to him. Again, he had that Kane thing that I think helped him, where he never spoke, or at least not that I'm aware of, or he spoke very infrequently, I should say, if he did at all. And just, yeah, always in a bloodbath of a match, or, I keep using definitive phrases, for the most part in bloody matches. If he didn't pull out a foreign object, then he just used his teeth. And so, for those reasons, and just, his kind of just all out kind of animalistic style, if you will, I am going to go with Abdullah, and I'll say in a slight edge over Ox Baker. And I didn't touch on Ox a lot in this breakdown simply because I gave my feelings on him in the first round. But I'm going to go with Abdullah.
All right, so far it's 2 for Abdullah. Mike, if you're passionate enough about Ox, you could use your veto.
I am not passionate enough about Ox to move him on. Little spoiler alert there. No, I'm gonna go with Abdullah as well. Um, all due respect to Ox, especially if he more or less killed a couple of people in the ring. I mean, that's something. But yeah, Abdullah, in his case, if he didn't kill anybody, it wasn't due to lack of trying from some of the stuff you hear. So Abdullah was a legit wild man, would cut people, not even with their approval, if you will. He would just, if he felt like it, he would gig them, as they say. So, and obviously did enough of that himself. He was a big guy, had the that forehead with the massive deep scars on it, and just the craziness, the willing to do anything and everything, whether it's cut people, bite them. And let's not forget, this man was once electrocuted in a cage match in WCW, and I believe survived it. I mean,
Yep.
he's still alive, so clearly it did not kill him. So that has to count for something as well. So all those things said, yeah, that's my reasoning for going with Abdullah. So it looks like Abdullah's going to sweep this round and move on.
And just a real quick tidbit, Tom mentioned the Rimco figure, which I still currently have. It's sitting on the shelf behind me. One of the few Rimcos I still have left, which is a story for another day. But my Abdullah is pantsless and bootless, but his body is pretty good on the figure. He's probably 230 pounds. So it was interesting choice of body type that Rimco used, but still, it's an amazing figure.
Yep, that it is.
Okay,
Classic.
absolutely. Next matchup here, we have The Undertaker, Mark Callis going up against Gangrel. Mike, do you want to take this one?
Wow. Sure. This is an interesting one indeed. Yeah, obviously we already said pretty much everything we needed to about Gangrel, from the entrance, the blood, the fangs, um, the Undertaker. Of course, this is his first time coming up because he got a bye, and I think the Undertaker. Anybody that knows wrestling over the last 30 plus years knows who the Undertaker is. It's one of the most famous gimmicks in wrestling history. Another tall, brooding figure, big guy. He's gone through some gimmick changes as well, but the original gimmick, just the slow walk down to the ring with that music, the lighting. He roll the eyes into the back of his head, do the tombstone pile driver. Again with Paul Bearer. He'd come out with Paul Bearer, who always had that urn that I believe was supposed to give the Undertaker his powers, if you will. So I like both of these guys. Both these guys again are definitely either one of them could realistically win this tournament, because both of the guys had quote unquote scary gimmicks. But man, it's whew, just because of the fact that the Undertaker has endured for so long. Ah, man. You know what? Actually, yeah, this one's tough for me. You know what? Actually, I was about to go with the Undertaker, but just going off of its scariest pro wrestling gimmicks, I was going to give the Taker the edge initially, just because he's been around for so long. But scariest gimmicks, just for me, even though again the presentation of the Undertaker was good, but Gangrel with the blood, the fangs, hell with it. My gut, and it could change if we did this an hour later or an hour before, but my gut right now, just scariest gimmick, tells me Gangrel. So screw it, I'm going with Gangrel.
Nice. Tom, what do you think?
Because it's the second round, we like to move a little faster typically, and I will leave no suspense. I'm going to agree with Mike. I'm going to go with Gangrel, and the rationale with that is this. We're talking about scariest gimmicks, and I'm talking about, believability, running into somebody in real life, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously Mark Callis, a big man, could certainly handle his own against the majority of the population. But in terms of gimmicks, though, Undertaker being a dead man, a zombie, if you will, walking to the ring and, you know, being brought back to life, and, that he'd be knocked out, I guess, and then he'd do that sit up like he was, awaking from a long slumber in a coffin or something like that. I just didn't. And I know there's going to be a lot of the WWF fans that, in WWE that hear this and immediately disagree with me, and I'll be most hated. But I just was never a fan, and I didn't think there was believability. I just thought it was silly that a zombie could walk down to the ring and wrestle. It didn't make any sense to me. So for that reason, I'm going to go. You can say, well, Gangrel, he was a vampire. But it's certainly in the way he played the character and the lengths that man went to, as we previously discussed, was certainly more believable than a zombie walking down to the ring. So I'm going to go with Gangrel.
All right. Excuse me. Well, we have a 2-0, so I would have to be passionate enough about Undertaker to use my veto and move him on. Yeah, like Tom said, now in these later rounds, we try to keep it shorter for brevity's sake. I was on the fence with this one. I will say to you, Tom, that I wouldn't consider Undertaker to be a zombie.
Oh,
He's
he
a dead
was.
man.
He was.
He's a dead man.
Oh, well, I take it back then.
Yeah, with supernatural abilities. But you know what? I will agree with you guys, and I'm gonna go with Gangrel as well. I mean, all I can say is the teeth. It just wow. So we have a clean sweep. We've got Gangrel
And I
going
will
over
add,
Undertaker.
Oh no, I was just gonna add because Tom said he'll probably get some hate. That's why I always stress we're not. Obviously the Undertaker is a more enduring gimmick. He's been around for 30 plus years or whatever at this point. I mean, nobody's arguing. Of course, Undertaker is a much bigger gimmick, much bigger star. But remember, everybody listening, this is scariest gimmicks. So not the best gimmick or
That's a good
most
point.
popular. Because Undertaker is obviously one of the biggest stars in wrestling history.
Oh, yeah.
But going by the title of the tournament this week, if you will, scariest gimmicks, and
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point by Mike. And I mean, because Mark Callis, some would probably put him on their Mount Rushmore of all time. That's how good he is. But yeah, in terms of this, Mike has brought up a good point. It's just scariest gimmick. Tournament podcast Halloween special, folks.
Yep.
Absolutely. And if you're liking what you're hearing here, guys,
They are.
Please consider. Yep. The confidence is brewing. Please consider liking. That would definitely help us out. Subscribing to the channel. As always, we love to converse back and forth. Comment. Tell us what you think. Any future podcasts we should have, tournaments, etc. But moving forward here, back into the action. We're now real deep in the tournament here. This is a semifinal action. We have Abdullah the Butcher going up against Kane. I'll go ahead and start this one out. Again, especially going forward now, we're going to really try to be quick. For me, I have to go with Abdullah. Kane was physically menacing, so was Abdullah in a different way, but just the sheer brutality, I have to go with Abdullah on this one. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, let's see here. Quickly, that's a tough one. Yeah, as you mentioned, the sheer brutality of Abdullah, the bloodbath that was Abdullah the Butcher. Kane, though, in his own special way, I mean, was, very scary and menacing, and I'm not a fan of WWE, WWF, but there's a few things over the years I will admittedly say, wow, what am I going to say? They knocked it out of the park. They got it right. This initial Kane gimmick was one of them. But if we're going to go with Scariest, and you're like, oh my God, I'm really fearful this guy's going to do something to me. It's close. It is really close. But I think I would also go with Abdullah.
All right. 2-0. Mike, are you passionate enough about Kane to use a veto?
I am not.
I know what Mike's doing.
Oh no, I'm not.
He's
actually
waiting till the
holding...
championship round. That son of a.
No, I was much more passionate about last week, but not as much this week. No, again, I said Kane, the gimmick, the stature, the mask, the entrance music. He again had like that. Was it red lighting to change the atmosphere? And I know Jim Cornette, I think, once said he was kind of patterned after Michael Myers, like when he would do the sit up and stuff and turn his head and the no talking, the lack of verbal communication, all that, I guess, was kind of patterned after Michael Myers. So, big fan of Kane, but Abdullah, again, another big guy, maybe in a different manner of speaking, but still a large gentleman, crazy, legit, tough guy that would hurt people. Yeah, I mean, just involved in some of the bloodiest wars in wrestling history. And again, was electrocuted and lived to tell the story. So I got to go with Abdullah as well.
Nice. Clean sweep.
Yep.
The next semifinal matchup here, we have none other than Bruiser Brody against Gangrel, who so far is steamrolling in. Tom, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. We have, we've had Gangrel now over multiple rounds and have expressed our fear, if you will, of that character, in a good way, how well that he pulled that off. But again, because I said, well, in the last round, Undertaker is a zombie. I mean, but, you could say, well, Gangrel's a vampire. So kind of taking it from that angle. In this one, I'm going to go with Brody. And it's ironic that it doesn't mean that's how this is going to play out, but that the championship would be Brody and Abdullah, who kind of came up together. They were the same in that same era and had, I don't want to say many, many matches together, but I know they faced each other on numerous occasions. I just think the Brody character, again, versus the vampire, is more believable. And in believability, that something really could be or really could happen, I think it makes it more scary. So Bruiser Brody gets my vote.
All right. Mike, who do you have?
Nice. Bruiser Brody was a legit madman as well, in a similar vein to Abdullah, just the crazy, unpredictable nature. But again, Gangrel really fit the bill for scariest character for me just because of the look. Yeah, everything we've already discussed, and but where people could, like we've alluded to, or Tom, I think, just alluded to again, people could say, well, Undertaker's a dead man, Gangrel's a vampire, but again, Gangrel's teeth were legit, and I don't know that he does this. I know there are some people that consider themselves vampires, and I believe do drink blood. Not saying he does that, but it's not out of the realm of possibility because there are people that do it. So yeah, I mean, he potentially could have. I mean, we know the teeth were legit. That could have been a legit, like him in real life. Just how Bruiser Brody was the gimmick. Gangrel may have lived his gimmick through and through. So yeah, his is, for me, is definitely more believable than the Undertaker because we know Mark isn't deceased. So I don't know. Just I would be intimidated by either one of these men, but just the look of the Gangrel, the teeth and everything, I gotta stick with Gangrel again. So we're gonna put Marty in a weird position here, a tiebreaker again.
Yeah. This is a tough one. This is, as we mentioned to earlier, this is the scariest, not, the best, or, who was the better wrestler. This is the scariest gimmick. Bruiser Brody was his own gimmick, the wild man. I mean, his size, he was a monster. Um, you know, Currently he'd still be considered a monster at whatever 6'7", 6'8". Gangrel, we keep going back to it, and I've said it multiple times. The teeth. I mean, Gangrel was a good sized man as well, nowhere near the size of Bruiser Brody, but with his real life shaved teeth, um, the attire he'd wear, he'd have on like a white, puffy, vintage looking shirt, like a Victorian shirt, and there'd be blood on it. Oh man, this is a tough one. I think by the skin of my teeth here, I'm actually going to also go with Gangrel.
Nice.
Tom, you
Wait a minute.
could use your veto here to push Brody into the finals.
And it's tough because I was immediately going to say, well, and I am going to use my veto. But I think before we use vetoes, and at some point I do think we need to discuss that if we're going to allow them in the championship round. But maybe we'll start 2022 with a little bit of a different approach to the tournaments. But we've said many times before, when it's such a close matchup, though, if you don't feel that strongly, why would you use your veto? And Gangrel, as much as I'd love to see the character of Brody move on, I mean, Gangrel certainly is not undeserving to meet Abdullah the Butcher in the championship round. So, and it's almost like a 60-40, where I'm 60 to allow Gangrel to move on, 40 to use my veto. But to me, that is relatively close. So I wish Brody would be moving on. But I'll go ahead and accept Gangrel, and I will not use my veto.
Nice.
Well, we've come down here to the finals. We have Abdullah the Butcher, the wild man from the Sudan, against Gangrel, who may be a real-life vampire. Mike, do you want to take this bad boy first?
Sure. As we've said, everything we pretty much needed to say about both these guys. Yeah, for me, the just based on appearance, I would say Gangrel looks scarier. Again, the whole vampire getup, but then with Abdullah, like I said, you've got, we know Abdullah's a wild man, or was a wild man, unpredictable. You didn't know getting in the ring with him if you were going to get cut, what was going to happen. I mean, he would he would do what he wanted to do to anybody else and himself. As we can tell, the poor man's forehead looks disastrous. With all due respect, Abdullah. Man, yeah, this is a tough one.
This is basically fork versus teeth.
Yeah,
it is.
I like the Gangrel gimmick, the get up, and all that. But yeah, with Abdullah, the intimidation factor was legit because yeah, you didn't know if you were gonna get hurt in there, stabbed, cut, bitten. Man, I think without delaying it here, I'm gonna give the slight edge, man, to Abdullah. Because Gangrel, again, I like the appearance, but with Abdullah, there could have been a legitimate fear. I mean, most likely Gangrel, even though the teeth were real, he wasn't going to bite somebody in the middle of the ring. But with Abdullah, there was a legit fear that you could get bitten, stabbed, cut, and potentially cut with something that had already been used on someone else. So we don't know what the hell Abdullah was thinking for a period of time there, and he was a legit wild man. And so yeah, I'm gonna give this one to Abdullah. As much as I've been supporting Gangrel this whole time, he ran into the buzzsaw that is Abdullah the Butcher.
Nice, Tom.
Yep, I'll be very quick as well. I think in every round, obviously up until the last one when I picked Brody, I went with Gangrel. And every round I've gone with Abdullah, so obviously this makes it a little more difficult. But and on a little side note, if you created a drinking game listening to these podcasts, and every time I said obviously or phenomenal, you'd probably be wasted in the first 10 minutes. But
Man, that sounds like a phenomenal drinking game.
But I think I'm going to agree with Mike here, and they're close. But in using that criteria that I brought up a couple times in terms of reality, and I mean, I just think that Abdullah played this wild man with, some foreign object, and if he didn't have the foreign object, as I mentioned earlier, he was just going to sink his teeth into you. I mean, he didn't really go in to win as much as he went in to hurt and maim people, and he played that character brilliantly. So I'm going to go, and no offense to Gangrel, I mean, the lengths, again, he went to live that character and still does to this day, because I've seen him in recent interviews with the huge fangs. I'm going to go with Abdullah as well.
Well, we have a clean sweep here.
Nice.
Looks like our winner will be Abdullah. Unless I do what I'm about to do, guys. I'm not going to use my veto. It was somewhat close. I also was leaning a little bit towards Abdullah, actually. So I'm kind of glad that you guys both went that way. It didn't put me in the hot seat. Like you said, with Gangrel, it's mainly the teeth, the visual. Abdullah, I mean, his size, the forehead, the weapons that you knew. He had so many weapons hidden on him, it wasn't even funny. Forks, taped up little, who knows, a splinter of wood possibly. But I agree, Abdullah the Butcher, and he will be the winner of this week's Scariest Wrestling Gimmick.
Congrats to Abdullah.
Yes.
Nice.
And as always, if you guys are enjoying the content, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. That would help us out a lot. We will be back next week with another episode of the Tournament Podcast where matchups are everything. Until then, thank you folks for listening. Goodbye.